Welcome to Ask For It, a podcast about owning your career from interviews to promotions and everything in between. Hosted by Amit Trivedi, ex-Salesforce and founder of High Performa. Every week we get into the mindset, strategy, and confidence it takes to grow on your own terms. On this show, we talk a lot about asking for what you want, but today we're exploring what that looks like if you're not aiming to be CEO tomorrow. What if you just want a career that's fulfilling, stable, and still going somewhere? Matthias Mahr is joining me today to talk about his new book, How to Be Moderately Successful, and how asking intentionally can be just as powerful. Matthias Mahr is a first-time author based in London, UK, with a 25-year career spanning consulting and industry. His new book, How to Be Moderately Successful, offers a refreshing and often humorous take on ambition, fulfillment, and what it really means to make it. I'm so excited to have him here to dive into his new book. So Matthias, welcome to Ask For It.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, I would love to start off by understanding why did you write this book and why moderate success?
So, as you said, I have spent the last 25 years in consulting and industry, so I'm not a professional author, but certainly over the last 5 or 10 years, I've done more and more career discussions with people, both in my team, across the businesses that I was in, and also outside of the businesses, because people came to me and I started writing down some of those bits of advice I gave to people. And eventually it sort of built up into quite a few little stories. And I thought, you know what, actually, this could be quite a useful book. And that's why I've written the book.
Wow, that's awesome. So I'd love for you to talk more about that. What kind of patterns did you see in coaching or the corporate life that inspired it? Any stories you'd like to start off with?
Of course. So the main thing really that I saw is that people, I think, as you said at the beginning, they are aiming high, and that's a good thing. But that means sometimes they don't quite know where to go next because they might read a book or they might have a role model that's like a CEO or someone very successful and they want to get there. And again, that's great, but they can't quite figure out what might be their next step in their career.
Mm,
And what I've seen is that having sometimes smaller changes, incremental changes, can get you there faster, at least in the beginning, and really helping people figure out where to start in their career development and what to do next was the key thing that I want to help with.
that's true. I really like that. And I guess that way it's more attainable versus thinking of this really far goal and then getting burnt out along the way.
Exactly. And I think this incremental thing, it really does add up after a while. If you make small changes over, 2, 3 months, maybe even quicker sometimes, it really can add up to a bigger change. So that's why my book is also structured in quite short bite-sized chapters. There's quite a few of them, and you can really dive into whichever one resonates the most. And there's also an action in each of my chapters to make sure that you can really apply it very quickly and see and feel some of those changes and some of that impact as quickly as possible.
That's great. And I like that you really show that success is looking different for everyone. So you just get to that first step, like that base camp, and then you can decide what happens next. And I know right now so many people are so focused on that hustle culture. So I'd like to understand why you decided to use the word moderately successful.
Yeah, so I mean, it's partly really to make you think about it, right? But it really is also, there's a lot of truth behind it because a lot of books, as we started talking about, I guess, are written by CEOs or are really inspiring stories of people who've been super successful, which is, again, it's great. But I felt there was a bit of a gap in that first part of success. And you mentioned the word base camp, and I really like to think about it like that. If you think of it as a mountain that you're climbing ultimately. So this book gets you to base camp, right? Which actually could be defined however you want it. So I'm not defining specifically what that means. And it could be just as an example, it could be maybe a head of department or a senior manager, but it really depends on what it means for you. And that's actually the beginning of the book is helping you figure out what does that look like for you. And the idea really is that it gets you to this base camp where you're comfortable, where you've got the money that you want, you've got a comfortable life. And then you can figure out from there what happens next. And if you want to keep climbing this mountain, if we stick with the mountain analogy, then you can keep going right into the thinner air, into the higher reaches. That's totally fine if that's what you want to do. And there's plenty of books that will do that. Or maybe you decide actually base camp's quite a nice place to be and you like the view and the food's good and you'd rather watch other people kind of struggle on ahead. So that's the next step. But this is really the first step for people in their maybe mid-careers, maybe earlier to mid-careers, trying to get, as I said, to this first step of base camp.
I love that. And I'm wondering as well, you know how so many people feel that pressure, right, to always aim for the top? In your life and career, why do you think that's always the goal? Why do you think everyone's striving so far to get ahead versus understanding what their base camp is?
I think it's a really good question. And again, it's one of the early chapters of the book is to try and make you figure out like why are you actually striving for what you're striving? What sort of drives it deep down? And I'm not a psychologist, right? All I've done is I've written down some stories, some ideas, some actions. But I think it's important to try and understand it. And it can be for all sorts of reasons. Often it's your parents that are sort of driving it, or maybe you think they want you to drive it, you know? It might be your friends. I think it's rarely your friends, though. I think, in my experience, your friends really don't care how successful you are. Sometimes it's yourself. So I think it's actually a really important first step for you to figure out what is it that drives it ultimately in terms of where you want to go.
So I guess a lot of self-reflection to fully understand like what will make you happy. And I know that
Exactly.
sometimes there's that freedom, right, in asking for less or the right things versus asking for everything.
Exactly. So the first part of my book, there's 5 sections. So the first section is really all about that self-reflection piece. The rest is all about actions. In fact, even the self-reflection piece has a lot of actions in, but the rest is all about tips and tricks to really get you to improve quickly. But I felt it still was very important to have that first section to make you understand what drives you, also what sort of person you are. There's a bit of a quick fire personality test in there, a bit of an inventory of what you like, what you don't like, as a sort of base understanding of what drives you and where you are today. But then you said about the freedom and asking for less or the right things. So I think definitely that's the case. And you still need to be proactive at the end of the day, right? Or I suggest that you're proactive, but it's just about how far do you want to get with that and how much do you want to push it in terms of what you're striving and what you're asking.
True. And I like how you mentioned earlier about like those nano habits that you kind of just like go to that next stage and then kind of make that micro ask. So you're not asking for like the end goal, but you're asking for what's in front of you. So I like that intentionality behind it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And often people will ask for, a promotion or for more money. Actually, many people don't ask for that. So I would also recommend that you think about whether you should ask for that, because some people are feeling maybe an imposter syndrome or otherwise
Mhm.
aren't up for asking for that. So I would still encourage you to be proactive, because typically at the end of the day, people who ask for more will often get more. But it is also asking about some of those perhaps intermediate things that might not feel as scary or as big to ask for. So just things like a career development meeting with your manager, or some feedback, or maybe some available opportunities to join a project. Or you can even do some basic things like write the minutes, sorry, of a meeting. Although with AI, who knows where that's going? But
True.
write the minutes of a meeting, which is kind of boring and no one wants to do it. But if you do that well, then maybe next time you're being asked to do the agenda for the meeting, and then that actually allows you to set the agenda and influence it, and then people will get to know you and so on. So it doesn't, as you say, always have to be asking for I want to be promoted tomorrow. It can be asking for some of those intermediate steps which will get you there faster, I guess.
True. And then it can also make you ready for it because a lot of people feel that every year they need to ask for that promotion to get forward. So it's like if you feel ready and you want that promotion, go and please ask for it. But if you don't want it, you can ask for different types of opportunities to still feel fulfilled. So I really like the way you reframe that.
Exactly. Exactly. And also there's a chapter later on about getting promoted, and we might come to it in this chat as well, but it's a lot easier to get the promotion when you've already been doing that new role, really,
Mhm.
rather than saying, "Hey, I want to step up, please give me the stretch opportunity." If you already lent into that a little bit before and you've proven that you can do some of that work that the higher job needs, then it'll be much easier to get the promotion in the first place.
That's true. I mentioned in one of my past episodes as well, it's about like psychologically framing yourself as a person who's ready for that promotion in front of your manager's eyes. And by doing that job and already being in that kind of role, it just becomes like a natural fit. So that's a
That's
great point. I'm excited to talk more about your chapter on promotions as well. So
that's exactly
before we
right.
get into your chapters, I know you mentioned role models. So I'm just curious because I know you said that sometimes it's not your friends, it's not your family, but how would you
Mhm.
suggest that the listeners kind of identify who those right role models are?
I just think, again, back to this moderate success idea for me in this book is pick some intermediate role models, if you like. So obviously if you pick, I don't know, Oprah or David Beckham or whoever's your role model, that's great, and they're super successful, and if you can get there, fantastic. But at the end of the day, only 0.001% of people will get there, right? So why don't you in the meantime pick a role model perhaps within your company, of someone who is at that higher level, or someone that you look up to, or someone that's a senior manager of some sort, and see if you can emulate them. or even a peer perhaps that you think is, sort of at the same level, but kind of one step ahead. And you can also
Mhm.
pick and choose from different people in terms of the role modeling rather than having necessarily one single person. So it's just about, again, choosing the right person that will help you get ahead in the next 2, 3, 5 years rather than somewhere where you might be in 10 or 20 years.
Okay, that's awesome. And I guess that kind of goes into your chapter about like getting a mentor or two. So I know I'm jumping ahead, but
Mhm.
actually, let's get into your chapters because I know that you have lots of areas in there. So in your book, you cover essentially the entire process of looking for a job and then succeeding once you're in them. So let's touch on three major aspects of that because I know a lot of my viewers are currently interviewing or they're trying to develop their career or they're trying to get promoted. So I know one of your chapters was about impressing people at interviews in your top 10 tips. Could you give us maybe about three major tips that could be helpful?
Of course. Interviewing is a really interesting one. And I've obviously interviewed, but also I've had people, I've interviewed people, about a hundred at least, I think hundreds over the last few years. So I've learned from both sides, I guess, as the interviewee and the interviewer. So a couple things maybe to pull out. So the first thing is doing your homework. And that sounds really basic, but you'd be amazed how many people don't really do the homework. And what does doing the homework mean? At the base level, it means understanding the company that you're interviewing with. So what are some news items? What do they do? What's some interesting tidbits that you can then also feed back to the interviewer so that they understand you've spent the time, as well as the interviewer themselves. You can look them up on LinkedIn or somewhere and again try and pick out a couple of tidbits of things that they may have recently done that they're passionate about. And you can feed that back in a conversation, which really will make them understand that you've spent that time and really have got under the skin. And as a bonus, which is in the chapter as well, is try and use the company's product if you can. And again, it sounds really basic, but let's say I interviewed for a health club chain a little while back, and I just went to visit 3 or 4 of their outlets because they weren't too far away from me, although it took me a few hours, and also some of the competitors' outlets. And then you can feed that. It gives you a better understanding of the product anyway, but also you can then feed that back in the interview and say, "Hey, I went to this store and I spoke to the club manager, John, and he told me this." And that just makes it really, really personal as a discussion. So, if possible, you can do all those things and they will take time, but they really will pay back in terms of what you're going to get back from the interviewer. So, that'd be my first tip, is just really do your homework and spend the time that's needed.
That's amazing. Honestly, like doing your homework, and nowadays with social media, the internet, AI products, it feels like you have no excuse to not do the homework behind the company because it's like really at your fingertips. But I love how you said to use the product because I think that's a lot of things that people miss. And I'm reflecting back now before when I was interviewing at Salesforce, and I actually pretended to be like a small business and get like a demo call. And I didn't want the demo. I just wanted to hear like how did the salesperson interact with me? What kind of touch points were they making? And it makes such a difference to bring that up in the interview. So love that tip. I feel like that's something a lot of people don't really think about doing.
Yeah, and it's normally pretty easy. Obviously, depends where you apply for, right? Sometimes that is harder than other times, but 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, it's easy enough to do with a bit of imagination, like you just said, that you pretend to be a small business and you set up a call. The next thing is, I've called it here, let them speak, in the book, which is all about making sure that you find the right balance between speaking and listening, because obviously you want to sell yourself in the interview and you want to talk and you've got all these great points that you've prepared that you want to make, and that's really important. But also make sure you engage with the interviewer, listen to what they want to hear and answer their questions rather than just talking. And maybe sometimes actually just let them talk. I've had a lot of interviewers that just love the sound of their own voice. And sometimes you just sit there and don't say too much. And actually, that's great because that's what they want to do. But a specific example here is really often when you start off as an interviewee coming in, the person in front of you will have your CV open and will go, "So I've looked at your CV. Tell me a bit about yourself." Often what that means is it kind of is code for, I haven't really had time to read your CV because I'm a
Mm.
busy person. And they just want to buy a bit of time so that they can go through it. So at that point, clearly you want to do that, but don't spend 10, 20, even 30 minutes going through all your CV from the beginning to end, right? Find a 3-minute version or max 5-minute version that touches on the highlights and then says that you're very happy to come back to any of those points, because that just bridges that time while the interviewer catches up and figures out the specific questions they actually want to ask without taking up half the interview by you just talking without stopping. So make sure that you have a short version of that, and that you also check in with the interviewer regularly to go, is that what you wanted? Is that enough? Can I give you more detail, rather than just talking all the time?
That's such great advice. I know a lot of people start to ramble and then it becomes exactly like you said, like a 20-minute discussion where you're just explaining your whole resume. So I like they said, like pick three things, make a highlight, and then ask and check in as well. And then that also frames in more of a conversation with the interviewer versus you just monologuing, which helps build that connection as well. So that's a really good point.
Exactly right. And I keep forgetting that in the US it's resume rather than CV. So I
Oh,
apologize
yes.
for the English one. It's the same thing.
No, this is great. Very global call. So we got a lot of viewers from around the world. So they'll get it both resume or CV.
Sounds good. So maybe a couple more things. One of them I've called here in the book, be easy to love. And what that means is you may have a lot of questions or uncertainties about the job that you're interviewing for. Is the commute a long way? Where's this company going? Do I even like the people? Is it the right culture for me? All these things are all valid. And clearly, before taking the job, you need to make sure you've answered them. But for the first one or two interviews, make it easy for the interviewer to love you. Say how great their product is. Maybe put to one side some of these questions or most of those questions that you have initially, to avoid the interviewer thinking, well, does this person really want their job? I've got all these other guys over here, or interviewees over here, candidates who just really want it. And maybe this person isn't that keen. So at the beginning, make sure that you're loved and you sound super keen on this role. And then later on in the process, you can come back to some of those tougher questions and figure out whether you really want the job or not.
True. I really like that because also it's about that connection aspect. And if you put yourself in the company's shoes, you want employees that are excited to work there and love the product, love the company, and are like keen to learn more. So by positioning yourself as that, that will really get you like right through the interview process. So that's a really great point. And I feel like a lot of your tips here really hit home.
That's great. And then the last thing on interviews, a couple of questions. Obviously, you want to prepare for all the basic questions in interviews, right? So telling me about a time when you've driven some growth, tell me about a time when you worked in a team, all those questions you can look up online. But I think the two key ones that you have to have a really, really good answer to are, one is, why are you the best person for this job? Why should I hire you? It's a really basic question, but sometimes people just fumble because they haven't really thought it through properly. So you need to have a really clear answer on why they should hire you. What are your 2, 3 differentiating factors? And then the other flip side of that question is, why is this the right job for you at this point? Why do you want this job right now? And again, you just need to have a really clear answer to those two questions. So I'd strongly recommend that you prepare those two in advance.
True. And I always think of that as kind of like your 30-second elevator pitch, essentially. But it has to be curated to the job you're applying for. You can't just have one that's just a generic one either.
That's right.
No, these are great, Matthias. Thank you. I'm sure the listeners are going to find these really great. I'll summarize them as well and put them into the notes. And then, of course, read the books so that way everyone can see them way more in detail. So, the second aspect here, I know you talk about, is a lot about like developing your career and getting a mentor or two. And we spoke about role models earlier. So, would love to understand more from you here on what you really mean by that and what kind of methods you would recommend.
In terms of career development, clearly you need to understand yourself what you want to do and make sure you do the right inventories and answer the right questions and figure out where you are. But I think it's also important to get external advice for that. Clearly from your manager, typically, who has a role to play, a really important role to play in your career development. And in most companies, managers do that reasonably well. So hopefully that's already happening for you. Or if not, you really should ask your manager to have some kind of career development discussion. But I think it's also really important to get a broader perspective of that from perhaps your friends, but also from, as you say, a mentor. And I think especially as you uh, go towards your mid-career, but even in your early career, getting someone from outside the business or inside the business that you're in, but not directly in your line, so who's a bit more removed from the day-to-day, as a mentor who can help you figure out, A, where you want to go and just bounce off some of those ideas and some of those answers that you may have come up with, and then also help you figure out how to get there. I think that's really important. And in terms of what sort of mentor to use and how to find them, it's quite important to be clear as to what it is you want from a mentor, because they can play quite different roles. And in this case, I'm talking really about a career development mentor as opposed to a mentor perhaps for a specific skill. You can find them in lots of different places. So the tips for me is, aim high-ish, but not too high, a bit similar to the point before. If you try and get someone as a mentor who's super senior, they might either say no, or they might say yes, and then they might not have the time to do it or not really be focused. You might be lucky sometimes, but generally, if you aim a bit higher but not excessively high, that's a good thing to aim for. As I said, looking inside and outside your company, and then just making it easy for them to say yes, by being complimentary of what they do, perhaps suggesting breakfast maybe rather than say lunch or coffee, because breakfast is often an easier time to get into busy people's diaries. And then just being really clear on the expectations that you have from them. And then normally the way I've experienced the mentor relationship is that you probably meet them every maybe 2 months, 1 or 2 months, something like that. And you just prepare the questions and the ideas that you have for them. You take them for breakfast, you talk them through, you follow up, and then you schedule another one, maybe a couple of months down the line. And often that goes for, sometimes you can go for a long term. So I've got a mentor, not formally, but a friend, an ex-colleague that I'm working with that's been going on for 10, 15 years. But sometimes it can only go for 6 months or 12 months, because then you've reached the end of that natural relationship, and that's fine as well. But either way, I'd recommend that you find at least one person who's a bit removed from your day to day, who can give you some honest advice and who you can bounce your ideas off of.
I like that. And I like that whole idea that you said, like, have like a diverse group of mentors as well, that you can tap into them. I call that my board of directors. So I pretend like I'm a company and then I pick mentors based off that. So I love that you brought that up. And then the tip on breakfast, I never thought about that. That's something I'm going to take away immediately as well. Because it's like, I guess lunch is tough. Evenings, people don't want to talk or do any more work. But breakfast, that's so like not that threatening. It's not too much time taking out. So that's very brilliant. Thank you for that tip.
Breakfast works more easily. And then the other thing is schedule it reasonably far in the future. I mean, that's for any meetings really, but it's just a small thing. If you say, hey, do you have time next week? No one has time next week. I mean, they might do, but unlikely, right? Whereas if you schedule something in a month or two, that's harder to say no to, and the month will come fast enough. So that's just another way of
True.
getting the time in.
No, that's such a great point. Because I know that's a thing that a lot of people have a tough time doing when reaching out to mentors, because they don't know how to ask for that. So that's a great advice right there. Ask for a month out, ask for breakfast. Awesome. And now let's say you got the career, you passed the interview, you have your mentors. Now I'd love to know more about your chapter on getting promoted and stepping up. And you did say that the best way to position yourself is by acting like you're already in that role. So can you please talk more about that?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit before, but in the book I'm calling it the number one best career advice I've ever received, and it's probably true. Which is, so the specific wordings from my boss was, if you want to be a director, then act like one. So this is from personal experience, where quite a while ago now, but I was more complaining about the fact I was in a head of department role and I really wanted to have this director title in this company. And I was kind of complaining semi-openly about the fact that I hadn't been promoted to this level yet. And if only I were a director, then hey, I could make all these decisions and I could spend more time on strategy, and wouldn't life be great? And as I said, my boss kind of went, hey, if you want to be a director, then act like one. Do it now. And I think that's just really stuck with me. So rather than kind of limiting yourself by your current role and going, well, I'm in this role right now, and therefore I can only go this far. I'm not allowed to do these other things. Just try and take some ownership, try and take a bit of risk sometimes, and maybe overstep the mark in a controlled way, right? But just grab a bit of opportunity and think, well, if I was a director, if that's what you're aiming for, whatever the next step are, what would the person do? What would I do if I was in that role already? And then just try and do that now as much as you can. And as you said at the beginning, that's the easiest way ultimately of getting that promotion, because if people in the promotional panel, normally there's multiple people, it's not just your manager typically. Sometimes it's just one person, but often it's more than one. They'll ideally want to react by going, "Oh, I thought this person already was a director. I sort of didn't see that." And then it's just the easiest promotion ever, right? So if you can do that, and if you can remind yourself to step up and to take that extra opportunity and that extra step, then that's a really great way of trying to get a promotion.
True, because in the end, it's all about positioning, and however you position yourself is the way it's going to, like, your career trajectory will take. And at that point, like you said, like people will start to just assume, like, oh, I thought he was always a director.
Mm.
And then they start to sing your praises, and then your management and leadership chain is like, oh, he should be a director. And then you will be in the next promotion. So that's great advice.
Yeah, that's really that. Yeah, that is definitely one part of it. The other part, though, on the promotions bit, I've got a second chapter in here on the process of promotion. So this is really boring, if you like, but it's also really important, and especially if you're in a bigger company, there will be some quite complex, sometimes codified ways of how promotions exactly work, and who decides, and what time of the year, and what do you have to prove, and what rating maybe did you need to get in the previous year to be considered for promotion, etc. So it's also, I think, important to understand how those processes work and make sure that you make them work for you so that you follow whatever those rules are. And if there's multiple people involved in the decision, again, that you pick them up one by one, that you make sure they understand who you are, that they know what work you've done. So that's the other part of it, is to play the game a little bit, and understand how the formal process works and just stick with that 100%.
True. And one of the advice that I always give to my listeners as well for that is that you have to just ask somebody to tell you what that is. So for me, like I used to ask my manager, I'm like, what is the promotion cycle? Who do I need to like talk to be able to get to that next level and how can I do it? And people are surprised by how much information they'll give you and they'll help you navigate that as well versus going in blind because it can be very complicated, as you said.
Exactly, and either you can ask your manager, or HR is often very happy to do that. And I've got a section in HR which in many companies, and I feel a bit bad for them. Certainly in the last few companies, people can be sometimes a bit cynical about HR, and or at least about the process, and think it's sort of rigged against them, or someone's trying to help their friends or whatever. And it all gets into a little bit of cynicism of, oh, this is just not going to work for me. And actually, the HR, in my experience, try really hard to make the process as transparent and as fair as possible. Maybe not in all companies, but in a lot of them. So just trying to understand what that is and trying to, again, go with it rather than assuming it's not going to work for you, which sometimes people do. It's just important to do.
Yeah, that's true. I like that. Make HR your friend. Even I would be scared to go to HR, but that's awesome advice there too, because a lot of times they're probably just waiting for you to ask. So that's
Definitely.
awesome.
Definitely. They deal with a lot of problems as well. So if someone just asks a friendly question and say, hey, how, please help me. How can I figure this out? They're often delighted.
That's true. I like that. That's really cool. Yeah. So I guess the whole cycle in itself, like from interview, from career development to promotion, is just that you have to be strategic, move forward, and then understand exactly too, like what does success mean to you? What's your next step? And then plan it out that way.
That's right. It's not always going to work, but it certainly will tilt it in your favor. I'm convinced about that.
That's true. And I know that you talked a bit about burnout as well and some mistakes that overachievers make. I would love to get your perspective on what you think some classic mistakes are or things that people can identify before they lead to that burnout, and then kind of help them pivot towards understanding that they should take a more moderate success perspective on their career.
I think the number one classic mistake really is to focus too much on the negatives and on the things that aren't working, or the things that you haven't quite yet achieved, and to forget that actually you are probably doing a really good job in a lot of ways. And to remember that, and to take strength from that, and to take a step back and make sure that you internalize that occasionally. And that's always the tricky balance to find, particularly for A-type personalities, right? Is you want to push, and it's great to be ambitious and to be proactive, but at some point you also need to take a step back occasionally and go, actually, I've achieved some really good stuff here. I've made some great progress. So it's making sure you keep those two things in check, and probably for overachievers to remind yourself often enough that actually you underlying it all, you're doing a really good job and people are giving you good feedback and you're delivering some results while still wanting to strive for the next thing. Because otherwise it can, as you say, often turn into this burnout thing where you think everything is against you and you forget the fact that actually you're doing a really good job. And then the other thing probably to say is that you're not alone. And I've got a chapter in here called "You're Not the Only One That Can't Sleep at Night," which is obviously a bit pointed, but the idea here is that you might think sometimes, oh, I'm the only one that's burnt out. It's just me. Everyone else is coping. I'm the only one who can't cope. I can guarantee you, you're not the only one. So find some people to talk to. If you start opening up even a little bit to one of your colleagues and it's like, last night I really had trouble sleeping because this thing was going in my head. 9 times out of 10, the other person will go, oh, yeah, that happens to me a lot as well. And then at least you're no longer alone, right? And you can talk to someone about it. And you realize that to some extent everyone is in that sort of boat as well. So I think that really helps as well. Those are my two tips really, is remember that you're good and talk to someone about it.
That's great because I think if you follow that type of exercise as well, it can help prevent that imposter syndrome. So it can help you keep moving forward strategically as well versus kind of bringing you back. So I know that once you hit that kind of cycle in your head where you don't feel good enough and then you start to burn out, it's really hard to recover from that. So by talking about it openly and just kind of understanding that you are good enough and that other people are going through it, I think it just makes it a little bit more like realistic and like understanding that it's a common problem and we're all working towards getting better. So I
Mhm.
really liked that. And for that as well, I'd love to understand more about kind of your favorite tools or frameworks and exercises from the book. Because while I was reading your book as well, I saw that you had several kind of checkpoints throughout. So if you can give an exercise that we can probably do live or something like that for the listeners, that would be great.
My book has about 40 or so chapters, all very short, between 2 and 5 pages, and you can kind of dip in and out a little bit as you want. And each of them does have an exercise or an action for you to do, because I'm really keen. I'm quite an action oriented person. So my personality comes through in that, and also in some of the stories I'm telling about my life and my experiences, which illustrate some of those points. But yes, you're right. Each of them has an action. So I think my favorite ones probably are right at the beginning. It's about understanding who you are as a person. And there are a couple of personality tests that are quite well known. One is called Myers-Briggs, that you might have heard of, and one of them is called the color wheel or the color inventory, that some people may have heard of as well, or may have even done at work. And normally these things take half an hour, 45 minutes. You need to pay money, you need to fill in a very long questionnaire, but I've tried to distill it down to a very short set of questions. There's 4 each, and that gives you an initial idea of what you might be and what sort of personality you might be, which helps you a little bit understand how you react to things. But also, as we go through the book and we go into understanding and working with other people, then helps you understand how you might work with people who are not the same personality as you, and you may feel very different initially and maybe very annoying initially, and it helps you understand, well, why are they different and how can I try and bridge that gap in terms of our different approaches. It's going to be a bit tricky to do live on air, I think, but just to illustrate, it's things like the key axes around things like introversion versus extroversion, for example, or around thinking versus feeling. So do you think with your, or do you make decisions with your head or with your heart, is the thinking versus feeling one? Or the question I'm asking here on the first one is, after a couple of hours at a busy drinks reception, do you feel tired or invigorated? If you're invigorated, you like to be an extrovert. If you're tired, you like to be more of an introvert. So they're quite basic questions, but it just allows you to start understanding the areas of that drive you, I guess, and that make up your personality, and then in time also that of others, and that help you figure out where you're coming from and how you can overcome and bridge maybe some of the more difficult relationships that you have with other people.
True. And I like how you really make it more like concise in your book as well. I know I tried to do a Meyer Briggs test before and it took like half an hour to an hour. But in your book, I did it within like a minute and it gave me quick understanding of who I am, which was very interesting to see as well. And like you said, once you understand who you are, that can help you understand how you interact with others. So those are always really interesting and helpful exercises.
And then I think an extension of that, or the next exercise to do, I've got a chapter called Working with Idiots.
I
And
love the naming conventions of your chapters.
yeah, everyone, it's funny, everyone loved that chapter, interesting enough. Or everything, weirdly enough, everyone thinks, like, the first question I get is that book, is that about me? And I'm like, no, why would it be about you? Like, you're fine. Like, people are very self-conscious about this stuff. Anyway, so that one, the idea is it's in 2 parts. So one is to try and figure out the people that you think, and idiots, what do we mean by idiots? It's just a catch-all term for people that you find a bit annoying to work with, right? And you can define exactly how you define that. The first part of that chapter is trying to figure out, are these people really idiots? Or again, is it just, do they just have a different approach and a different mindset to your own? And you've just assumed that they're idiots because you just don't quite understand where they're coming from. And I'm going to bet that you can reduce your list of the quote unquote idiots in your company by maybe 50% or more by just figuring out that actually, you know what, some of them, they're just very different to me. And therefore, I need to make more of an adjustment and they'll need to make more of an adjustment to work together. So that's the first part of that. But then the second part is there will be some people who probably are still on your list despite your best efforts. So then there's some coping strategies in there as to how you might work with them, which includes potentially avoiding them is one option, or finding some kind of common other, maybe enemy is a strong word, but other target that you can kind of work together for a common good to reach something, or to, maybe do something else. There's some coping strategies at the end of those that remain as idiots, quote unquote, on your list.
I like that because in the end, it's that mindset shift, right? Because you can't not work with these people. Like they're part of your life, they're part of your day to day. So just by reframing how you think about them and their styles, you're already eliminating half what you said, which is amazing. And then the rest is coping and how to deal with them. So I find that really helpful. And I find it really funny as well how people started to think it may be written about them. So that kind of shows how you think of yourself sometimes, which is really funny.
It is, right? Back to the imposter syndrome, or the sort of, it's the lack of self-confidence, maybe a little bit, right? That people think, oh my God, is it me?
That's so true.
And
No, but
it's definitely not about
great
any
take on
particular person.
it. One of the favorite chapters for sure. All right. So I know we're nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to do a few rapid fire questions for you just to bring this home. So, one thing I would ask is I don't know if that's the same chapter you talk about, but what chapter do you think people should read first?
I just think it has to be the beginning one about defining your own success. I think you can read the chapters generally in any order you like, but I really would encourage readers to start with the first two, which is what even is success for you? And then the personality one, but particularly the first one. You have to kind of figure out, what does success mean and why do you want to achieve this particular kind of definition of success? And then you can figure out how to achieve it. But if you haven't got that straight in your mind, then you're just gonna be a bit in the dark as to what it is that you're trying to do.
That's true. I like that. And then on this podcast, we're always talking about asking for it. So, what's one ask that changed your career?
I struggle with this one, but I think the one I'd point out is I worked for a train operating company called Eurostar that some of you readers might have heard of, or maybe not. They operate trains London to Paris, London to Brussels. So if you're
Yeah.
ever in this part of the world, it's a great train service. And I was responsible in the commercial team. My background is commercial, so I was responsible for the loyalty program and a kind of smaller part of commercial, maybe about 10 or 15, a team of 10 or 15 people. And a person alongside me who was responsible for revenue management, which is a really core part of Eurostar, and had a team of about 30 or 40. They left for reasons that I forgot. And so my boss, who we both reported to, was starting to look at, well, replacing this person and hiring somebody. And I said, you know what? I think I could do this job in addition to my own. I've never done revenue management, but I've got all the basic competencies of analytics and team management and kind of understanding profitability and targets. Why don't you just give that to me for 6 months and we'll see how it goes? And if I do well, then maybe I can keep it. And he did that because he trusted me, which was great because I'd been there for a couple of years, but also because it always takes time to hire a new person anyway. So he didn't lose much in terms of time. And in the end, it worked out well because it was a success, and I get to keep it. And I expanded my team from, as I said, 10 or 15 people to nearer 50 in a pretty quick succession, not long after John Eurostar. So you've got to take opportunities as they come along. I also talk about luck in my book, actually. And as much as you should make your own luck, and a lot of it's about proactivity and asking for things, sometimes you just have to be a little bit lucky, but you also have to make your luck by picking up the opportunity that presents itself.
That's true. Yeah, because if you never asked for that opportunity, he would never have just given it to you. So you're able to create your own luck in that sense as well, which is awesome. And last question for you. Do you have any career advice for someone who's kind of mid growth in their career versus someone who's been there for years and someone who's starting?
I think the most important bit at that point, I think, is probably to be clear or get clearer on your value proposition and your unique selling points. I think when you start out, you don't really need that too much. Let's say you're an analyst or you're a salesperson or whatever it ends up that you're doing. There'll be loads of opportunities for you to try out. And whatever you do, if you don't like it, maybe after 2, 3 years, you do something else. The kind of the world's your oyster and you have tons of opportunity. But ultimately, companies are pyramids of some sort, right? So that as you get more senior, there'll just be fewer opportunities at that level around. And so if you want to get those opportunities, you'll need to start over time developing your own unique value proposition. What is it that you can bring that no one else can? And if you stay a generalist for too long, while that's great because it keeps your options open, at some point, I think it becomes more of a negative because hiring managers and companies will want to start looking more for specialists, and there will be a specialist around probably for the more senior job. And you can go, yeah, but I'm a generalist, I could do this. And the company will go, yeah, you probably could, but we have this other person over here who's already done it, and they're the specialist, and then you might lose out. So I think as you go through your mid to early senior career, I'd encourage you to start specializing and start being clearer on what it is that you can bring. I'm the digital marketing person, or I'm the whatever it is, biotech salesperson. I'm just making things up here, but just start developing a little bit of specialism that you can go after if you haven't done that already. Some people may have done that from day one, and that's great. But if you haven't, then that'll be my advice. Just start narrowing down your options a little bit at that point.
That's great advice. It's all about that value proposition differentiation, especially in the tech industry today as well. There's so many opportunities to specialize. So I really like that you brought that up as an advice. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, I highly encourage you all to check out Matthias' new book, How to Be Moderately Successful. It is available globally on Amazon, and I'll include the link in the show notes so that you can grab your copy. You can also connect with Matthias directly. He's very active on LinkedIn and always open to thoughtful conversations. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this. Take a moment to reflect on your own version of success. Not society, not your bosses, not your friends, yours. What does moderate success look like for you? And what will you ask for next to make it happen? Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Matthias, for coming on to Ask For It, and I'll see you all next week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Ask For It. If this episode was helpful, I'd love if you subscribed and shared it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready for a bit more support, I do offer one-on-one coaching. The link's in the show notes if you want to check that out. Until next time, keep showing up and don't forget to ask for it.